What idea or assumption has either changed or evolved the most over time?
One is, as you know, that I've written about and spoken about quite a bit, this transition from fear-based advising to strengths-based advising. I mean, look, fear, not unlike sex, sells. And advisors say, gee, what keeps you up at night? Let's talk about that. And, you know, I created the concept of Wealth 3.0, growing out of the idea that it's time to move beyond that, because actually that was really starting to constrain us quite a bit and having a lot of bad side effects. We had bad research talking about bad false statistics. And so I think the change of this core of not just hearing the anxieties of G1s, which kind of is where we began in this podcast, but validating them. Saying, actually, you're right. You know, have I told you 70% of wealth transfers fail? So your kids really are going to be destroyed. So let's talk about how we can somehow avoid that catastrophe.
Welcome to another episode of On Pointe, a podcast by Element Point Family Office. Today, David and I had the great pleasure of interviewing Dr. James Grubman, someone whose work we've long admired. Dr. Grubman is a well-known figure in the family wealth advising industry, is the author of Strangers in Paradise, and he's the co-author of Cross Cultures and Wealth 3.0. His work has also won him numerous prestigious industry awards. Dr. Grubman has decades of experience helping ultra-high net worth families and advisors navigate the challenges of wealth, governance, and succession. I hope you enjoy our conversation.
Dr. Grubman, thank you so much for joining us today on the On Point podcast.
Well, thank you for having me. I'm really happy to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
We are as well. And I have to tell you, I've been excited about recording this for quite some time. As you and I briefly spoke about in preparation for this, I have been a fan of your work for many years. I started in the industry of managing wealth for high net worth families back in 2008, right around the financial crisis era. And
tough time.
Yeah, it was a very interesting time to enter the field, certainly. And your book, Strangers in Paradise, which I believe was published in around 2013, if I remember correctly.
Yes.
Was a book that really resonated with me on a number of levels. It taught me a lot about the way that families think about wealth, and also I drew a lot of parallels to my own experience, being the first generation American child of immigrants to the U.S. And so it really had a meaningful impact on me. And I'm so excited that we could have you here today to join us for this discussion.
Well, thank you. And your experience is not unusual. And when I wrote the book, I had no idea what it was going to become. But a lot of people, including sort of dual immigrants, or sort of geographic immigrants and economic immigrants, and people immediately connected with the idea in it. It's a very sticky idea. So I'm glad that it has helped you and hopefully maybe some of the clients that you've had.
Absolutely. And as we think about the work that you've done over these years in studying families and the way families adapt to wealth, I constantly think back to your work back in 2013, but as you and I spoke about, and I think we all know, so much has changed in the period of time since. And perhaps the psychology of people perhaps remains the same, but certainly the environment surrounding us, or the industry, the economic situation, all of those variables have changed in meaningful ways. What are you seeing that's changed, and how has that impacted families that you're studying and working with?
Well, it's funny because, I mean, when I wrote the bulk of Strangers was around 2012, 2013, which is 15 years ago almost. And I am going to be doing a second edition update. In fact, I'm working on it right now and hope to have it out within about 6 months. So I have recently read through the book again myself to remind myself about a lot of stuff. And it is funny how some things are evergreen, and you're right. The world has changed, and some of the things that I talked about there, for example, I talk about teaching your children how to write checks to college and involving them in writing big checks. Nobody writes big checks anymore, that it's all electronic and digital. You may, make big transfers, but a lot of the procedural things I talked about, using uniform trust for minor accounts, UTMA and UGMA type accounts. And although those are still around, it's more 529 plans and some other things. There are some anecdotes I tell in that book that are getting a little outdated because of digital apps and different things that go on. And we could talk more specifically about that. And I think, interestingly, in 2008 to the 2012 period, that was a horrible time. And we were coming out of the Great Recession that caused a lot of damage to families. It stressed a lot of families. Some found that they were resilient. Some had to learn some hard lessons at that time. And a few people that I have spoken with more recently actually made their fortunes during that period of time. So it's funny to think that we're going on 15 to 20 years from that era.
Yeah, it's amazing. And it was certainly a very interesting time, difficult time for many. One thing that Carlos and I think a lot about is the fact that among younger wealthy individuals, particularly those that created their wealth in the last 15 years, they didn't experience that period of time the same way that the prior generation did. And often I think that impacts their risk tolerance. When we think about it from an investment standpoint, it's all been positive, overwhelmingly so. Certainly there's been brief periods of time where markets have declined, and there's been periods of, slight economic distress, but nothing that comes even close to what we saw during the great financial crisis. And I'm curious your perspective on that, just having seen this new generation of wealth creators that skews younger and hasn't really, or even those that inherited wealth, but that have not experienced the downturn of a magnitude like we saw in the great financial crisis. How is their perspective on things different?
It's a great point. And it goes to something that, we have all dealt with and know about, which is the inherent anxieties of the first generation G1 wealth creators who come from middle class, working class, or even poverty, and have made it well. And then they talk about, well, never forget, you could all go away, and it's not guaranteed. And what their risk tolerance is like, but also the flip side of they're saying, hey, it could all go away tomorrow, so be careful with it. And the reality that often G2s and G3s say, which has a lot of validity to it, which is actually, it's really unlikely it could all go away tomorrow. It could drop back. We could be in bear markets. We get that. But there's a lot that's known about good management, risk management. And if it all does go away tomorrow, that usually means something was wrong in how the family has been managing its wealth. And so the conversations about financial security, you never know what's going to happen and what that's like for the G1s, and reinforces, be very careful, don't spend too much, everything else, versus G2s, G3s, does create some interesting conversations in family meetings across the generations, and certainly in your work, in working with clients.
Absolutely. And as I think about it, I guess it's really been true throughout U.S. history that there's been this generational divide, because every generation really has experienced markets and the economy in different ways, going back to, those that were Depression era, children, and then the subsequent generation, boomer generation, and on to today. So I think, certainly the generation and time period to which someone is born seems to have a pretty significant impact on the way they perceive risk and wealth and how to manage it as well.
Well, the other thing is time horizon around, making it through long enough periods of time to have a sense that both, money can be made in bull markets and things can go well. And you also need to be careful on the downside. And I think for families in general, particularly doing a generational transition, I can remember working with one family where there was that sort of, you never know what can happen, and we have to stay lean and hungry. And you have to have the fire in the belly and be entrepreneurial and stuff, and many things we hear from G1s. And the equally valid comments often by G2 and maybe more mature G3s of, it's a different world. We have to make it through both up and down markets. We need to make sure things are well set. But the idea of it could all go away tomorrow, and therefore, it has an impact on a variety of things, we don't quite buy into that, Grandpa. And that, and they have a legitimate point too. And I've in this family that I'm thinking of, one of the things that I worked on was getting the grandparents to realize that the G2s and G3s, including their family office advisors, had done a pretty good job of managing risk in a different way than G1s know. As the MFO that we were dealing with for them often like to say, it's not that we try and predict when the next storm is coming. What we try to do is make your portfolio storm proof. And so we don't think so much about, oh my God, is the market going down or whatever. It's like, we're in it for the long run. And that's a very different approach. And I think a lot of G1s have trouble with that.
Yeah. Interesting. You've just highlighted a difference in how, these generations are approaching wealth and risk management. Curious if you're also seeing any big differences generationally between how they approach purpose, legacy, philanthropy. Do you see any other large, variances between generations?
Absolutely. And it's funny, you mentioned purpose. Another great buzzword is stewardship. And as I wrote with some colleagues in the book on Wealth 3.0, some of those things can get a bit ossified and set in concrete. And like the G1s will say, we need to have purpose. And for them, often the purpose is we need to be financially secure. That was the purpose in becoming successful, is so you don't have to go back to, difficulties of scarcity. But for G2s and G3s, their sense of purpose about the wealth, including the fact that there may not be unanimity around what that purpose is, that there's more variation. And so there's not often just one purpose for the wealth, or the purpose being what the G1 may be thinking of it as. Particularly for something not too long ago, within the past year, the issue of stewardship came up. And in a family meeting, and then during a break during a family meeting, I believe she was a G3, was talking to me, and somewhat hesitantly, because it felt like, a little bit of the wrong thing to say. She said, I struggle with how my family heavily emphasizes, you got to be good stewards. You got to be good stewards. You got to pass it on the same or better than you got it. You got to do this. And she said, to me, I feel like I'm just supposed to be a conduit. Like I'm supposed to receive it and not fuss with it too much, maybe get some benefit of it and pass it on. And it's sort of just supposed to pass through me and our generation on to the next. And, is that really the best way to handle it? And what if I want to do some things with it that are not overspending, but through philanthropy or working for causes? It's like, I feel like I'm just supposed to be a conduit for it and like, don't mess it up. She didn't say mess in that sentence, but I think the gist. And I thought she had a really good point. And we brought it up in the family meeting when we resumed, how do you go beyond being a good conduit to actually feeling like the wealth has purpose for you as an individual? And it generated actually a really good discussion.
That's such a great point. And I think many of us in the wealth management industry, perhaps, too often think that way about, stewardship and the next generation. It's almost like, it's a great point that she made. It's very easy to overlook the generation right in front of you.
Yes.
Because you're thinking, numerous generations ahead.
Well, it's funny because I think, again, the anxieties of G1 and elder generations in general really pervade a lot of the family culture in some families, and affects things like legacy. What is the legacy? With a lot of anxiety, because a lot of it is fear of, if I don't tell you, be a good steward, you're going to go crazy and you're going to spend and you're not going to think about this and that. And so it's an attempt to prevent things without understanding that it can backfire and people just can feel like, I'm not really supposed to either enjoy it or have much say about it.
On these differences of wealth and purpose, are you seeing families become more collaborative and interested in working out the differences, or are you seeing a move towards individualization, fragmentation? Well, any particular trends that you're seeing at this time?
No, actually, Carlos, is a great question, because what I'm saying, in a sense, is more dispersion, more variety of that compared to, like we talked 15, 20 years ago, where things were a little more regimented and there was, the G1s and the G2s, and even in working with G4s and G7s, the ideas were a little simpler, clearer, and follow these rules and you'll be fine. And now I'm finding a couple things. One is that there's a little more a wider range of the menu that families are able to talk about, with the idea of, number one, negotiating like how it want to be, not just prescribing it and receiving it. But the other thing is being willing to have the voices of the rising generation. It's like, I'm willing to listen to you, but you're going to need to make your case. And for some families, that's really healthy. That it's not unlike what I have sometimes talked about, some of the fights that go on over trusts and what it means to be a good beneficiary under a trust, where there is this balance, sometimes a tension, between autonomy and accountability, where with trust, for example, the beneficiary says, stay out of my life, leave me alone, let me have the money that I'm owed, but I want my autonomy. And the trustee, and thinking of sort of, the settlor and the wealth creator in the background, who may not be long gone, is thinking, yeah, that's really good, but this money is very hard earned. It's not easy to get back. You're accountable to being responsible with it. And so you get this back and forth of, you need to be accountable, yes, but I need to be autonomous. Yes, but you need to be accountable. And it goes back and forth and back and forth. And to your question, what I see is, with that sort of framing, it helps families talk about it from multiple perspectives, that it's not just be a good spender, be a good steward, have purpose, and you'll be fine. It's more of a conversation with accountability. Show me that you're handling this in a way that is not just license to spend or whatever. And I think when there's been adequate preparation, the rising generation recognizes that the more accountable they are, that actually the more their voice is going to be heard.
That's a really interesting point. And relatedly, we're seeing, and I'm sure you have as well, this proliferation of family offices in the last 10 to 15 years.
Yeah, there's quite a few.
Yes. Yeah. And obviously, the concept of a family office has been around a very long time. It's just become, I think, a major buzzword in the last 15 or so years. And it's now at a point, I think, where it's almost a term that's lost its meaning and become as much of a marketing term or a mark of kind of prestige or, attainment of a certain level of wealth, rather than any sort of idea of the business structure or ownership structure that it used to refer to. So I'm just curious about your perspective on it. And I know you've done work around defining many of these terms, or trying to define many of these terms.
I was thinking about that.
Yeah, I'm curious your perspective on what's happened in the family office definition, and then just the realm of this proliferation of family offices. What are your views on what's been happening?
Well, it's funny because actually I and colleagues at the Ultra High Net Worth Institute and in the industry have been looking at that quite a bit, because it is, a huge change and pretty top of mind in a lot of ways. My sense, and many others at the Institute, which is a nonprofit think tank and learning exchange for the family office level, I need to slice that up into different segments or aspects. One is, let's talk about the marketing aspect, particularly at the multi-family office level, where RIAs and even wirehouses, private banks, other stuff are rebranding what they used to call as, well, we have a private bank or whatever. And now it's, we're going to rebrand it as we have family office services, and we have a family office. And it's just changing, the name on the door. And that is marketing. And a lot of what the Institute, and I share the views, is clients really need to look through that and be good consumers to question the validity and how those services are delivered. Because there actually are some standards. You may remember Family Wealth Alliance of 15, 20 years ago actually created some guidelines and standards of what a multifamily office really should be, what's credible. And we think those guidelines are actually still pretty good. And we are firming up some of those things as well. And then there's multifamily offices and single family offices in particular, which are proliferating legitimately because wealth is proliferating significantly. I've sometimes talked about, and I don't know, we'll do a pop quiz for you both here, okay? Back in...
I'm nervous now.
Yeah, I know. Now you're like, uh-oh. In 1998 or 99, who was the number one person on the Forbes 400 list, and what was the level of wealth for that person or family? Do you remember?
I'd probably say Bill Gates.
Okay.
Bill Gates.
Bingo. No, that's correct. And how much, ballpark kind of thing, like how much money did Bill Gates have as the number one person on the Forbes 400 list?
99? Was that
David's
75
keeping
billion?
very quiet here. I'm sorry?
75 billion.
Okay. David, do you want to take a stab at it?
I think it was lower than that in 99.
Yeah. Which is the peak of the .com era. Yeah.
I'm going to go 25.
All right, we'll split the difference. It was around 50 billion.
Okay. We're right in the middle.
Okay. 50
That's why we're partners.
Yeah.
Together we'll come up with the right answer.
Between the two of you, you kind of get there. Yeah. 50 billion made you number one on the Forbes 400 list. All right. And now we're talking about people with 250 billion plus or minus 20 billion. It's like when that used to be a lot of money.
Well, on paper, Elon's way above that, but we'll see how SpaceX trades. But right,
yeah. But think of that in 25, 30 years, that we've gone from the richest person in the world having 50 billion to having 5 times that. So what it really shows is wealth creation has ballooned in the past 25, 30 years. And as a result, it would make sense that specialized offices to manage that level of wealth would also have ballooned. And we're talking, the typical number is we're coming up on 10,000 family offices, of which, also I think we need to look at the idea of culture and jurisdiction, where you can have a family office in Asia and various places around the world if you are very, very wealthy, which is, $60 million. And so, the term family office, we often think of from what I call individualist culture of, Western situations. But the main point being wealth has grown tremendously. And so naturally specialized ways to handle that wealth and a lot of what we've known about how to build a family office. And then we get into the proliferation of types of family offices, especially single family offices, virtual offices, embedded offices, distributed, hybrid. All of that is to answer your question and say, number one, the world has really changed and family offices legitimately, the need for family offices has grown, but marketing on one end and creative and interesting new ways to manage those levels of wealth have actually appropriately grown as well. So you cannot look at the family office market as a homogeneous situation, that it is really a lot of subtypes.
You referenced
absolutely.
the incredible wealth creation over the last 25 years, which we've all seen it and experienced it. I think that ties along with something we hear a lot about in our industry, this so-called great wealth transfer that, that we're, and I know you have some, maybe a different take
on for that. Yeah.
Yeah, a different take. It's interesting. I was looking at some information recently, and it suggested that the greatest amount of wealth transfer is being inherited by 55 and 60 and 65-year-olds. So it's not even really. It's not even like this wealth transfer to Gen Z and millennials that I think people think, and like what's going to happen with all these young folks when they become wealthier than they can imagine. So what does your research suggest about this, great wealth transfer that the industry is going to experience?
Yeah, I have been skeptical of the whole thing for a very long time because I got curious about it, and I have sort of a researcher's mindset. And so I pursued it, and I looked at some of the actual data, and I saw that article, Wall Street Journal, recently. I was just looking at the graph today also. And there are several things that people really need to understand about. And I always sort of say it like the old Dr. Evil of sort of the great wealth transfer. $150 trillion is going to be passing to an inheritor down the block near you next week. Number one, what most people don't realize is as wealth has grown in the last 25 years, the net worth altogether of the amount of wealth has grown tremendously, but that the pattern of how much actually transfers per year has remained relatively stable on a percentage basis. And so when you look at, the 150 trillion, and I'm going to have to resist the little finger there, they talk about, in the next 20 years, the next 30 years. But when you get granular, as that Wall Street Journal article did, and say, well, yeah, but how much is passing now? It doesn't really change, but the number is interesting because it's typically somewhere around 1.25% per year. Okay. Which is actually how it has always been, or even less. With a growing multiplier of the number, if 150 trillion is net household wealth or more, then at 1%, that's 1.5 trillion per year, which is like, well, that's the same kind of thing. So the numbers are getting bigger, but a percentage of a big number is just a big number, but it's not moving that much now. It's always sometime in the future. And they point out how, first of all, it is going to spouses. It's also going to foundations and a variety of, non-heir benefactors or beneficiaries. And so the delay is sort of stretching it out. But the thing is, by the time we get there, let's say in 20 years, how much wealth do you think there's going to be in the world at that time? Given standard wealth creation, it's going to be even more today. So, how much is coming to the Gen X person down the block near you that is available for the average financial planner it really has not changed. And that leads us to something you guys know quite well, which is what's the form of the transfer? Most people in middle class life think of it as, an inheritance. You get a big check although we don't do checks anymore, right? Um, and
a big wire transfer.
Wire transfer, and then it's big. But, we know 90% and more of wealth by G2 to G3 is in trust. And so management and discretion, decision making over that actually passes away from the beneficiary to other people. And so again, what middle class or general society people know about inheritance is very different than what happens at the upper reaches of ultra high net worth.
You're absolutely right, and read my mind. We talk a lot about the difference between inheriting wealth and having agency. As I think about it, it's one thing to have the autonomy and agency and ability to make decisions as it pertains to that wealth versus merely having it in the form of, being a beneficiary of a trust with limited powers and so on. And so I'm very curious. I know I've read a bit about how you think about this issue of control versus about maintaining control by the prior generation versus handing over greater control to the next generation.
Yeah.
Have your views on that shifted? What are your thoughts on how families should best approach that? Because we see in our seat every iteration of this from inheritance situations where the next generation is empowered with kind of full control and full power over the assets. And then the situation where there's just incredibly limited autonomy and agency. And I don't know that there's a right answer. Perhaps you have a strong view on this. Curious.
And I would add even situations where one person in the same generation has the agency over all the siblings, which is obviously can be challenging sometimes.
Which is not good in that situation. Well, again, it gets back to the idea of how does the wealth pass and who has, to use the legal term, discretion. In a sense, it goes to the issue of autonomy and accountability, which is if you don't quite trust or don't quite believe or have not quite prepared a rising gen inheritor to be accountable for handling the money well, you put it in trust and you basically make the trustee accountable. And the trustee, with fiduciary duty, understands actually accountability and how to exercise it. And it's actually, the beneficiary does not have as much agency because it's been moved away to the person who actually does have agency over the assets in the trust. Where, again, the dispersion or the changes in demographics that I've seen in working with many families is the idea of, number one, there's a lot more preparation and a lot more understanding of what goes into starting earlier, educating and preparing heirs to understand and be ready for handling larger amounts of money. And not just money. I mean, there's a lot of roles and responsibilities that people of wealth have in terms of ownership, knowing how to be a good director on a board. There's more than just how to manage money. And so there's a desire to essentially create good beneficiaries who can receive and handle larger amounts of money, and they handle it well because they've been prepared to. They're also able to step into positions in running enterprises and stuff because there's been more attention to preparation, education, and transition planning. But for many families, there's still the old thinking. And that gets us back to the lag period in trusts. Trust design and administration has a massive lag period. It's a lagging indicator, you might say. We're sitting here now dealing with trusts largely that were written 15 years ago and more, because they're come into play. More people are doing trusts where people get access when they're younger, 30s, 40s, 50s. And so those are more modern trusts, often with more modern language. But even so, you look back 20 years, and they were doing things like incentive trusts, which are horrible. I mean, it's not been that long. So trusts that are written now and a lot of estate planning and legacy design in the modern era is not going to be impacting families for a decade and more, often several decades, And so what most people, again, don't think about is this huge lag between the modern thinking about trust design and what people are actually living under of prior trust design.
Yeah. And so much of trust design is focused on tax optimization, which is not necessarily a bad thing, but I think that often the focus is overwhelmingly on tax and not enough on the type of incentive structure or other behaviors that the trust language is designed to promote. And so I think that's a great point. I mean, even for us, I would say 90% of the time when we're having a discussion with a family, their focus within that discussion as it pertains to trust planning is around tax mitigation or estate tax mitigation specifically.
Yeah. And again, different jurisdictions and stuff, but let's talk for a second about a very modern, I mean, literally within the last couple of years, aspect that is not so much about trust design, but trust administration in a favorable way. And you both know probably about the Delaware beneficiary trust statute, which interestingly, from my perspective, is interesting because I was involved with some people, John Gallo, a great trust and estate attorney, in helping do a new trust design called the Financial Skills Trust around 2010. And in the particular case that generated the reason we made this trust design, it was about how to foster a beneficiary to be prepared for and grow into and to really help that beneficiary do well with what was a significant amount of money. Now that's been codified in the recent Delaware statute that you can use trust assets for education and activities with like guys like me, consultants to come in and work with beneficiaries about different things. And that's a very, very new statute to support it, which means it's going to encourage more use of it. And there's controversies about it. But it's the idea of that can be implemented, next week. We don't need to wait for somebody to die or trusts to come forward with certain ages and stuff. Trust administration is actually, I think, a lot more sophisticated with some areas and in some trustees than it used to be. And that there's a lot more known about how to work in the trustee beneficiary relationship compared to 15 years ago.
Absolutely. And the overarching theme there, I think, which is really education and financial education. And you've been such a prolific contributor to education for high net worth families, particularly multi-generational high net worth families. And I want to segue to your work with the Ultra High Net Worth Institute, because I think it's really important and goes to that education component. Would love to just learn more about the work you've been doing recently. I know one of the big innovations, which I think is very important, is the Wealthosaurus project and the goal of defining certain terms that are directly relevant to ultra high net worth families and family offices. I think it's interesting as advisors, we are often trying to find the best ways to explain concepts and families with whom we are speaking. And I think that what you are doing in terms of building this glossary of terms that families can learn from without necessarily needing to directly interface with an advisor or a lawyer or someone else to gain that knowledge. I think that's so important. So hopefully I didn't steal your thunder there.
No, actually, you did a pretty good job of explaining it. And that was actually the motivation and the purpose for creating it. I'll tell you the background. The Ultra High Net Worth Institute, which is a nonprofit, I mentioned, a think tank. And that's really important because we don't sell services. There's no conflict of interest. We sit around and think up stuff for the industry and are looking ahead towards standards and guidelines because we're really thinking of the end user, which is the client family. And it began after an interesting conference in 2018, late 2018, where a variety of ultra high net worth families had an opportunity to vent. They were at a conference and they started saying things like, we don't know who to trust. Everybody says different things. Everybody has advice based on what they do, not necessarily what we need. People lie. I know that's a shocker. People lie. They use terms in different ways. We really don't know what is trustworthy. We wish there was a place that we could count on that gave us objective, reliable information that we could access. And some people who saw that said, there's an opportunity. And so the Institute was created. I came on board in 2019. And one of the main things we ran into and had to get serious about in the last several years was, as we have worked on other models and frameworks, we kept running into our own differences about what a term meant, like family office, multifamily office. There are some people in the Institute who actually don't believe that's a valid term and we should not be using it. A lot of other things. And so we decided to create, and I will say I helped spearhead the movement with our full-time librarian, and we created this Wealthosaurus. That's how we came up with that, and a little wonderful dinosaur logo. And it is actually, we decided last year to make it public and put it out on the public site, not behind the member portal. And it's actually growing in use. And there's almost 100 terms. And
Jim, I was going to say that when I was looking at Wealthosaurus, there was a term I haven't really heard it used much, but it jumped out at me: expert generalist. And as I read the definition, it reminded me a lot of some of the work we do, because you have so much complexity working with ultra high net worth families, and you really have to be an expert generalist and really be able to collaborate with other experts, issue spot, bring them into the table. And so it's a term I hadn't really heard before, but I like it. And, maybe I'll start to add it to my own vocabulary.
Well, it's actually, Carlos, you made a great point again there, which is not only is wealth changing, but wealth advising has been changing. And in 1999 and to 2010, integrated wealth management at a very good, complex level was just barely beginning to surface. And as we sit here now, 15 and more years later, people like Tom McCullough from Northwood Family Office in Canada, a lot of people at the Institute. I've been talking about integrated advising for a long time because I came over from the healthcare system where integrated care predates all that, and from the 1980s and 1990s. And I think we're seeing an important shift. And I will give you credit. You guys are good examples of the rise of the integrated advisor, of being able to manage multidisciplinary knowledge, to think of yourselves as quarterbacking what goes on. And I think that we've seen a shift in the models of family office level wealth management to really understand how to embrace and help the complexity of what clients go through in their lives. And that, to add one last thing, and the complexity at $50 million is not as complex as complexity at $900 million or $4 billion. And that's part of why the industry keeps changing at the high end.
Absolutely. Well, thank you for the kind words. That is high praise coming from you. I think we've always tried from the outset of the firm to recognize that the wealth management universe had changed, and that it was becoming so much more important to see the view from 30,000 feet, but also be able to go granular and really understand the minutia of every aspect of managing wealth. And I think the industry has made strides in the last 10, 15 years, but I think the industry as a whole, I think, has a long way to go, and families are changing. So it's a dynamic, iterative process at all times.
What's interesting is families are beginning to hear about and look for integrated systems and the integrated advisor, the expert generalist, because it solves a lot of the problems about the complexity that they struggle under and feel overwhelmed with. And so the movement, but again, most of the industry is very transactional. It's still back in what I call Wealth 1.0 and Wealth 2.0. But I think really we are entering the era, and have been for the last maybe 10 years or so, of Wealth 3.0, like you guys, more integrated services, people who know how to do that. And it's funny because, I'll tell you an interesting little anecdote. One of the nicest times I had in the Institute, because I come out of healthcare also in my first career, the Mayo Clinic heard about us, and I got connected to a wonderful guy, Amir Pasha, who is a guy in executive education and some things in the Mayo Clinic. And we had a wonderful 1-hour interview talking about the similarities and differences of integrated services in the healthcare system and in the financial services system. And it was wonderful. And he had a great comment when we were talking about, using the term quarterback. He said, actually, we don't really think of it like a quarterback. We think of it more like an air traffic controller, that the air traffic controller's job is to kind of have perspective on a wide view, know everything that's going on, but also to make sure that like the planes don't crash into each other and that things happen on time. And that coordination and collaboration job, we hadn't really thought about. I mean, we talk about with a quarterback, it's not just directing services. It's really overseeing and managing them in a way not unlike an air traffic controller, to make sure that there's no gaps, there's no overlaps, that things are being done, whatever. And I had not heard that metaphor and analogy, and I thought he made a really good point. What do you guys think?
That's a great analogy. I think I'm actually going to start using that from now on, along with expert generalist.
Quarterback is definitely overused, and I think this one
move beyond that.
We got.
There's also the orchestra conductor one. I think that's a little overused too, but I like the air traffic controller. That one's great.
Jim, I'm curious, over your many years, studying this industry, what idea or assumption has either changed or evolved the most over time?
Wow, that's I got to think about that for a second. Yeah, it's a very good question. Carlos, I got to give you credit. I mean, you're doing a good job. You're really like hitting all the points here today, Carlos. You're hot. I would say a couple things. One is, as you know, that I've written about and spoken about quite a bit, this transition from fear-based advising to strengths-based advising. I mean, look, fear, not unlike sex, sells. And advisors say, look, I can start great conversations by saying, gee, what keeps you up at night? Let's talk about that. And, I created the concept of Wealth 3.0, growing out of the idea that it's time to move beyond that, because actually that was really starting to constrain us quite a bit and having a lot of bad side effects. We had bad research talking about bad, false statistics. And so I think the change of this core of not just hearing the anxieties of G1s, which kind of is where we began in this podcast, but validating them, saying, actually, you're right. Have I told you 70% of wealth transfers fail? So your kids really are going to be destroyed. So let's talk about how we can somehow avoid that catastrophe. I think we did a lot of damage with that. So that would be one of the things I would point to as a major shift. But still, most of the industry is way back in, let's talk about what keeps you up at night.
Well, Dr. Grubman, thank you so much for joining us today. It was really a pleasure. And I personally cannot wait for the update to Strangers in Paradise, for it to come out. As you know, I give a copy of it to just about every new hire that we make at the firm, and many of our clients as well. So very much looking forward to it. Truly appreciative for all of the work that you do in our field. And thank you again for being here.
Can't thank you enough.
I appreciate it. And, as we have talked in this conversation, you guys also are living it and have taken it to heart. Because again, this is what we're all doing it for, which is the client who gets the benefit. And the more that people understand possibility and how to build resilience and capability, But it has to be delivered not just through me and my work with clients, but in everything that the two of you and your people do. So I think we share many of the same values, and it's been great talking about those with you.
Likewise.
Absolutely.
Thanks very much.
The information provided in this podcast is for informational purposes only and does not constitute financial, investment, or professional advice. The views expressed by the host and guests are their own and do not necessarily reflect the opinions of any organization or company. The host and guests may maintain positions in any securities discussed on the podcast. Always consult with a qualified financial advisor or professional before making any investment decisions.